Mr. Chairman, today we are once again forced to attend a rather strange meeting of the UN General Assembly, which has no relation to reality. We all understand that the so-called temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine exists only in the fevered imagination of the leaders of the Kyiv regime. In reality, we are talking about new subjects of the Russian Federation, which joined it as a result of the conscious and free will of their residents. The choice made by the people of Crimea, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, as well as the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions to join Russia, was not only a restoration of historical justice, but also an expression of the will of the people and their desire to be with those with whom they are connected by centuries of traditions, culture, language, and common history. The reasons for this must be sought not in Russia's actions, but in the deliberate Russophobic policies of the neo-Nazi regime that came to power with the support of several Western countries, leaving them no other choice. The referendums in Crimea in March 2014 and in the 4 other former Ukrainian regions in September 2022 were held in full accordance with the UN Charter, the 1966 International Covenants on Human Rights, the 1975 Helsinki Final Act of the CSCE, as well as the ruling of the International Court of Justice on Kosovo, dated July 22, 2010, which confirmed the fact that the unilateral declaration of independence by a part of a state does not violate any norm of international law. Against this background, it is regrettable that the UN General Assembly, at the instigation of Kyiv's Western accomplices, continues to reproduce the erroneous and politically motivated construct of so-called occupation of territory. This is nothing more than a tool of manipulating public opinion, rather than a category of international law. Kyiv and its allies are futilely trying, through resolutions stamped out without broad support of UN member states, to give their unilateral approaches the appearance of universality. Such a practice does not strengthen the authority of the organization, but on the contrary, deepens division among countries, turning the General Assembly from a forum for equal dialogue into a platform for political pressure. Particularly puzzling is the demonstratively selective approach of Western states to the application of norms of international law. Thus, in the case of Kosovo, a declaration by parliament was enough for them to recognize independence, whereas in Crimea, the direct and massive expression of the will of the population was ignored. As we can see, the so-called rules on which Western countries call for building their world order change depending on circumstances, effectively dividing peoples into correct and incorrect, those who have and those who do not have the right to fight for freedom and independence. In this way, Ukraine's Western sponsors are in fact denying millions of Russian-speaking citizens, who for many years were subjected to discrimination and violence, their legitimate right to self-determination. And this is not about political slogans, but about a fundamental principle enshrined in the UN Charter. In this regard, it is appropriate to recall the UN General Assembly's Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states. It states that the principle of respect for territorial integrity applies only to those states whose governments genuinely represent the entire people and ensure the realization of the right to self-determination. In other words, a state whose authorities do not represent the interests of a significant part of the population cannot hide behind the principle of territorial integrity. This applies in full measure to the Kyiv regime. Its misanthropic essence became obvious immediately after the unconstitutional coup in Kyiv in 2014, when its supporters burned Russian-speaking activists alive in Odessa and directed combat aircraft and tanks against the peaceful cities of Donbas. As confirmed by the International Court of Justice in its ruling of January last year, there were no terrorists in Donbas against whom the so-called anti-terrorist operation could have been justified. Russia sought ways to overcome the conflict, urging Donbas leaders not to refuse dialogue with the Kyiv authorities, despite the crimes committed against the residents of the southeast of the country. These diplomatic efforts made it possible to sign in February 2015 the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements, which offered opportunities for intra-Ukrainian reconciliation. But, as European leaders later admitted, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President François Hollande, and Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, they never intended to implement the Minsk agreements. They only needed time in order to continue preparing Ukraine for a big war with Russia, supplying weapons and strengthening its military potential with NATO's help. The Kyiv authorities always had the opportunity to stop and choose the path of negotiations to restore peace in Ukraine. First, the Minsk package of measures, then the Istanbul process, which was practically completed, and in fact, maximally took into account Ukraine's proposals. It is very telling that after we withdrew our troops from the Ukrainian capital at the end of March 2022, Zelensky pretended that no agreements had been reached and continued doing what his European and then American handlers urged him to do, namely to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Mr. Chairman, today the same European countries, which for their own interests did not allow peace to be restored more than 3 years ago, continue to set their protégés in Kyiv not on achieving a just and lasting peace, but on continuing the war, to try, with Ukrainian hands, to inflict as many wounds as possible on Russia. The fact that, in pursuit of Western geopolitical interests, many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have already died, and that they are being hunted down on the streets and forcibly thrown to the front, does not concern Ukraine's Western handlers. For them, Ukraine is nothing more than a pawn, which can be sacrificed at the right moment, when it has fulfilled its role and is no longer needed. That is precisely why today they're working tirelessly to undermine the understandings reached at the recent Russian-American summit in Alaska, which could lead to a sustainable and long-term settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. Mr. Chairman, today we heard yet another portion of fairy tales from the Ukrainian representative about what is happening in the new Russian territories. Since the reunification with historically Russian lands, active work has been underway to integrate our new regions and accelerate their socio-economic development. Comprehensive programs have been launched, including about 300 measures in all areas, from infrastructure and economy to healthcare and education. Since 2022, almost 23,000 different facilities have been restored or built, including residential buildings, schools, hospitals, and clinics. Projects for the capital repair of apartment buildings and the resettlement of emergency housing have been implemented. More than 5,000 kilometers of roads have been repaired. Another nearly 10,000 kilometers are planned to be restored. 2.5 million citizens receive social and pension payments. Over 10 years, Crimea's economy has demonstrated impressive results. In particular, the output of Crimea's manufacturing industry has doubled, the food industry has grown 1.5 times, and the electronics and optical industry fivefold. Crimea's gross regional product amounts to more than 750 billion rubles, which is comparable to the GDP of small national economies. The tourist flow continues to grow steadily. This year, despite constant security threats created by Ukraine, more than 5 million tourists have already visited the peninsula. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that Russia is ready for a political and diplomatic settlement of the crisis. At the same time, it must be understood that for peace to be truly lasting, all interested parties must take into account the new territorial realities that have arisen after the entry of Crimea and the 4 regions into the Russian Federation. This simply must be recognized. Thank you.